Michael Whitehorse's knees buckled on the forest trail, his arms trembling as the 85-pound wolf pressed against his chest. The animal's golden eyes locked onto his, not with the wild terror of a wounded predator, but with something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just any wolf. Dr. Sarah Clearwater dropped her medical bag, the metallic clatter echoing through the Montana wilderness as she stared at the scene before her. 8 years of veterinary practice had never prepared her for this. A man carrying a dying wolf like a child, both of them covered in blood that wasn't entirely the animal's. Michael's weathered hands shook as he recognized the distinctive silver markings along the wolf's muzzle. The same pattern burned into his memory from that terrible night. The night Sarah, his Sarah, had died swerving to avoid this very pack. "Get her inside now!" Dr. Clearwater commanded, her voice cracking with an urgency that surprised even herself. But as Michael stumbled toward the clinic, one question haunted every labored breath. Why had the wolf let him carry her for 12 miles without a single bite? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The small town of Whitefish, Montana, had always been the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did. Nestled against the backdrop of Glacier National Park, it was home to loggers, park rangers, and folks who preferred the company of mountains to people. For Michael Whitehorse, it had been both sanctuary and prison for the past 8 years. At 42, Michael carried himself like a man who'd forgotten how to stand straight. His weathered hands, scarred from years of construction work before becoming a park ranger, told stories of a life that had taken sharp turns. The laugh lines around his dark eyes had deepened into something more like worry creases, and his black hair, streaked with premature silver, was usually hidden beneath a worn baseball cap that read, "Daddy's Fishing Buddy," a gift from his youngest son that he couldn't bear to replace. The cabin he shared with his 2 boys sat 3 miles from town, surrounded by towering pines and the kind of silence that either healed you or drove you crazy. Jake, 16 and wise beyond his years, had learned to read his father's moods like weather patterns. He knew when to push and when to give space, stepping into the role of man of the house with a maturity that broke Michael's heart daily. Tommy, 12 and still believing the world was essentially good, had his mother's optimism and his father's stubborn streak, a combination that kept the household from sinking too deep into grief. 8 years ago, Sarah Whitehorse had been the town's beloved elementary school teacher, the woman who somehow made every child feel special and every parent feel heard. She'd had dreams of opening a reading program for underprivileged kids, of maybe running for school board, of watching her boys grow into men who would change the world. Instead, she died on a rain-slicked highway at 34, her Honda Civic wrapped around a pine tree after swerving to avoid a pack of wolves that had wandered onto the road. The official report listed it as an accident. No one was charged. The wolves disappeared back into the wilderness, and life moved on the way small towns force life to move on, with casseroles and condolences that eventually give way to awkward silences and averted gazes. But Michael knew what the report didn't say. He knew Sarah had been driving because he'd had too many beers after losing his construction job that morning. He knew she'd been the one behind the wheel because she was always the responsible one, always cleaning up his messes. He knew that every time he looked in the mirror, he was looking at the man who'd killed his wife as surely as if he'd been driving himself. The guilt had hollowed him out, turned him into a man who went through the motions of living while feeling like a ghost. He'd taken the park ranger job because it kept him in the woods, away from people who remembered Sarah's laugh, away from the intersection where it happened, away from everything except the 2 boys who needed him to be better than he knew how to be. Some nights, lying awake in the cabin's creaking silence, Michael could swear he heard wolves howling in the distance, and every time his chest tightened with a mixture of rage and something dangerously close to longing. The morning started like any other patrol day, with Michael checking the North Trail markers before the weekend hikers arrived. The September air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the forest floor crunched softly under his boots as he made his way through the familiar paths. He'd been walking these woods for 3 years now, long enough to know every fallen log and seasonal stream, long enough to spot when something was wrong. The first sign was the silence. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the kind of unnatural quiet that made seasoned rangers stop and listen. Michael paused, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. In his experience, when the forest went silent, it usually meant one of two things: a predator nearby or something hurt. The second sign was the blood, dark spots on the pine needles leading deeper into the woods toward Clearwater Creek. Michael followed the trail, his heart rate picking up as the spots became smears, then pools. Whatever was bleeding wasn't small, and it wasn't stopping. He found her in a clearing 20 yards off the main trail, caught in what looked like an old snare trap that some fool hunter had left behind. The wolf was magnificent, easily 85 pounds, with a silver-gray coat that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. She should have been terrifying, should have been snarling and snapping at his approach. Instead, she lay still, her golden eyes tracking his movement with an intelligence that made his breath catch. "Easy, girl," Michael whispered, dropping to a crouch 10 feet away. "Let me see what we're dealing with here." The trap had bitten deep into her right hind leg, and blood matted the fur around the wound. But what stopped Michael cold wasn't the injury. It was the way she was looking at him. No fear, no aggression. Just a kind of weary recognition that made no sense at all. As he moved closer, she lifted her head slightly, and that's when he saw it. A distinctive white marking along her muzzle, shaped like a crescent moon. His hands started shaking before his mind could fully process why. 8 years ago. Rain-slicked highway. Sarah screaming as the pack crossed in front of their headlights. The alpha female, silver and magnificent, turning back to look at them before disappearing into the darkness. The crescent moon marking visible for just a moment in their headlights. "Jesus," Michael breathed, and the wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice. The snare had been expertly hidden, probably set by one of the illegal hunters who occasionally drifted through the park despite the hefty fines and jail time. Michael had been finding more of them lately, cruel devices that didn't distinguish between target animals and protected species. This one had done its job too well. As he examined the trap mechanism, the wolf never took her eyes off him. She should have been in shock, should have been unconscious from blood loss and pain. Instead, she seemed to be waiting for something, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "I know you," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to her or to himself. "You were there that night, weren't you?" The wolf's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but something like acknowledgement. Michael's radio crackled to life, making them both jump. "Unit 47, this is Base. What's your status?" He keyed the mic with trembling fingers. "Base, this is 47. I've got a situation on the North Trail. Large wolf caught in an illegal snare. She's in bad shape." "Copy that, 47. Standard protocol is to contact Fish and Wildlife for trapped predators." Michael looked at the wolf again. Standard protocol would mean waiting hours for a response team, assuming they could even get here before dark. By then, she'd be dead from blood loss or exposure. Standard protocol was what got wolves killed while bureaucrats shuffled paperwork. "Negative, Base. I'm handling this one personally." He clicked off the radio before dispatch could respond and knelt beside the trap. The wolf's breathing was shallow, her eyes starting to glaze with pain and exhaustion. She was going into shock. "Listen to me," Michael said. his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm going to get you out of this thing, but then we've got a problem. The nearest vet who'll treat wildlife is Dr. Clearwater, and she's 12 miles from here. Think you can handle a little road trip?" The wolf's golden eyes fixed on his face, and for a moment, Michael could swear he saw something like trust there, or maybe forgiveness. Either way, it was more than he deserved. He worked quickly to spring the trap, wincing as fresh blood flowed from the wound. The wolf whimpered but didn't try to bite him, even when he had to manipulate her injured leg to free it completely. When she was finally loose, Michael sat back on his heels, breathing hard. The wolf tried to stand, managed to get her front legs under her, then collapsed with a sound that went straight through his chest. "Okay then," he said, shrugging out of his ranger jacket. "Looks like I'm carrying you." As he wrapped her in the jacket and lifted her into his arms, one thought echoed in his mind. After 8 years of carrying guilt, what was 85 pounds of wolf? The first mile nearly broke him. Michael had carried injured hikers before, had hauled construction materials up mountainsides in his younger days, but nothing had prepared him for the dead weight of an unconscious wolf combined with the emotional freight of recognition. Every step jarred his lower back, the same injury he'd sustained in the accident 8 years ago, the one that flared up whenever stress or guilt got the better of him. By the second mile, sweat was streaming down his face despite the cool September air. The wolf's breathing had become more labored, and he could feel her heartbeat fluttering against his chest like a trapped bird. Her golden eyes would flutter open occasionally, fix on his face with that same unsettling recognition, then drift closed again. "Stay with me," he whispered, adjusting his grip as his arms began to cramp. "We've got 10 miles to go, and I'm too damn stubborn to let you die on me now." It was on the 3rd mile that the memories started hitting him in waves. The rain that night had been biblical, the kind of Montana storm that turned mountain roads into rivers and made even experienced drivers pull over. But they'd been late getting home from Jake's Little League game, and Sarah had been tired after teaching all day, managing the classroom's chaos, then cheering for their 10-year-old from aluminum bleachers that left her back aching. Michael had been drinking. Not drunk, he told himself then, and told himself now, just enough to take the edge off the humiliation of getting laid off from the construction crew. Just enough that Sarah had taken one look at him in the parking lot and held out her hand for the keys without a word. "I should be driving," he'd protested weakly. "You should be sober," she'd replied, but not unkindly. That was Sarah, direct but never cruel, even when he deserved it. The pack had come out of nowhere, crossing the highway like gray ghosts in the rain. Sarah had swerved instinctively, her teacher's reflexes kicking in to protect life even when that life belonged to wild animals. The Honda had spun on the wet asphalt, clipped the guardrail, and rolled 3 times before wrapping around a pine tree that was probably older than the state of Montana itself. Michael had walked away with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. Sarah had died on impact, her neck snapped clean when the roof caved in on the driver's side. Now, carrying one of those wolves toward salvation, the irony wasn't lost on him. His legs were shaking with exhaustion, his vision blurring from the physical strain, but he kept walking. Each step was penance, each mile an attempt to balance scales that would never be even. The wolf stirred in his arms, her head lifting slightly. Her nose twitched, and she made a sound. Not quite a whine, more like a question. Michael looked down to find her studying his face again with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "Yeah, it's me," he said quietly. "The son of a bitch who killed your family. Funny how things work out, isn't it?" But there was no anger in her gaze, no accusation. If anything, she seemed to be trying to tell him something. Her ears pricked forward despite her obvious pain. By mile 4, Michael's radio had been buzzing intermittently with calls from dispatch, other rangers checking on his status. He'd turned it off after the third call, unable to explain what he was doing without sounding like a man having a breakdown in the middle of the wilderness, which, he supposed, wasn't far from the truth. The forest around them was changing as they descended toward the valley floor. The towering pines gave way to aspen groves, their leaves just beginning to turn gold at the edges. Clearwater Creek ran parallel to their path now, its voice a constant murmur that reminded Michael of Sarah reading bedtime stories, her voice soft and constant and comforting. The wolf's condition was deteriorating. Her breathing had become shallow, and blood from the snare wound was seeping through his jacket. Michael found himself talking to her, partly to keep her conscious and partly to fill the silence that threatened to drive him crazy. "You know, she would have liked you," he said, pausing to rest against a fallen log. "Sarah, I mean, she was always rescuing something. Injured birds, stray cats, kids who got picked on at school. She had this theory that everything deserved a second chance, even things that seemed broken beyond repair." The wolf's tail moved slightly, a barely perceptible acknowledgement. "Course, she never met me after a bad day and a six-pack. Might have changed her philosophy." Michael laughed, but it came out hollow and bitter. "She used to say I was too hard on myself, that guilt was just pride wearing a hair shirt. Never did figure out what she meant by that." As he lifted the wolf again and resumed walking, Michael felt something shift in his chest. Maybe it was the physical exhaustion breaking down barriers he'd spent 8 years building. Maybe it was the surreal nature of carrying a wolf toward medical care while confessing his sins to the mountain air. Or maybe it was the simple fact that for the first time in 8 years, he was doing something Sarah would have approved of. The thought should have brought comfort. Instead, it brought tears. Mile 5 loomed ahead, and with it the steepest part of the descent toward town. Michael's legs were cramping, his back screaming in protest, but the wolf in his arms had begun to feel less like a burden and more like a purpose. "Almost halfway there, girl," he whispered. "Don't you dare give up on me now." By mile 6, Michael's world had narrowed to the rhythm of his footsteps and the wolf's labored breathing against his chest. The pain in his back had moved beyond discomfort into something approaching agony, and his arms felt like they were on fire. But Luna, he'd started thinking of her as Luna, though he couldn't say why, was still alive, still fighting, and that was enough to keep him moving. The forest had begun to thin as they approached the valley floor, and Michael could make out the first scattered buildings of whitefish in the distance. Civilization meant help, but it also meant questions he wasn't ready to answer. How do you explain carrying a wolf for miles when protocol demanded you wait for fish and wildlife? How do you tell people you recognized an animal from the worst night of your life without sounding completely insane? His radio had been silent for the past hour, which probably meant Chief Strongbear was either giving him rope to hang himself or organizing a search party. Bill Strongbear had been Michael's supervisor for 3 years, and in that time he'd shown remarkable patience for Michael's unconventional approaches to ranger work. But this might be pushing even Bill's legendary tolerance. Luna stirred in his arms, her golden eyes opening to fix on his face. There was something different in her gaze now, a kind of urgency that made his heart rate spike. She tried to lift her head, whined softly, then looked toward the tree line to their left. "What is it, girl?" Michael paused, following her gaze. "What do you—" The crack of a rifle bolt being worked echoed through the forest, and Michael's blood went cold. Someone was out there, someone with a gun, and given the recent increase in illegal hunting activity, that someone probably wasn't friendly to either wolves or the rangers who protected them. "Well, well," a gravelly voice called from the shadows between the aspens. "Look what we got here. Mike Whitehorse playing Dr. Doolittle with the local wildlife." Frank Red Cloud stepped into view, carrying a .30-06 hunting rifle and wearing the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. At 61, Frank was still built like the Marine he'd once been, but 3 years of drinking and grief had carved deep lines around his mouth and left his eyes hollow. Michael had known Frank peripherally for years. He was one of those men who haunted the edges of small-town society, welcome at the VFW, but not quite anywhere else. He'd lost his grandson Danny in a hiking accident 3 years ago, and the loss had twisted something fundamental inside him. "Frank," Michael said carefully, not moving, "this isn't what it looks like." "Really?" "'Cause it looks like you're cradling the enemy like a goddamn baby." Frank's rifle wasn't pointed directly at them, but it wasn't pointed away either. "That one of the wolves been taking livestock from the Henderson ranch?" "This wolf is injured, Frank. I'm taking her to the vet." "Injured, huh?" Frank spat into the pine needles. "Good. Should put her out of her misery right here, save everybody some trouble." Luna's body tensed in Michael's arms, and he could feel her heart rate increasing. Whether it was fear or some kind of protective instinct, he couldn't tell, but her breathing had become more rapid. "Put the rifle down, Frank. There's no need for this." "No need?" Frank's voice cracked with emotion. "Tell that to my Danny. Tell that to the boy who fell off Glacier Point trying to get away from a pack of these bastards. Tell that to the 3-year-old who'll never know his grandpa because wolves scared him into making one wrong step." Michael's arms were shaking with exhaustion, but he forced himself to stand straighter. "Danny's death was an accident, Frank. You know that. The investigation was bullshit." Frank's rifle came up, not quite aimed but ready. "Blamed it on inclement weather and challenging terrain. Never mentioned the wolf tracks they found 20 feet from where he fell. Never mentioned that he was running when he went over that cliff." For a moment the forest was silent except for the distant murmur of Clearwater Creek. Michael could see the pain in Frank's eyes, the kind of raw grief that time hadn't even begun to heal. He recognized it because he'd seen it in his own mirror for 8 years. "I lost someone too," Michael said quietly. "Sarah, my wife. Car accident 8 years ago." "I know about your wife," Frank said. "Whole town knows." "But she wasn't killed by something that could be hunted. She wasn't torn apart by predators that the government wants to protect." Luna made a soft sound, not quite a growl, more like a worried whine. Her head turned toward Frank, and Michael felt her muscles coil as if she was preparing to defend herself despite her injuries. "This wolf didn't kill Danny," Michael said, "and killing her won't bring him back. Maybe not, but it'll make sure she doesn't kill anyone else's grandson." The standoff stretched between them, two grieving men with very different ideas about justice. Michael's back was screaming, his arms were going numb, and Luna was growing heavier by the minute. But he didn't move, didn't give Frank a clear shot at the animal in his arms. "You know what the crazy part is?" Frank continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I used to like wolves. Used to tell Danny stories about them when he was little. Noble predators, I called them. Guardians of the wilderness." He laughed bitterly. "Noble, right up until they scared my boy off a cliff." "Frank, you got kids, Mike. That 16-year-old boy of yours, Jake, the little one, Tommy. What would you do if something happened to them? What would you do if wolves took them away from you?" The question hit Michael like a physical blow because he knew the answer. He'd do exactly what Frank was doing. He'd find something to blame, something to hunt, something to destroy in the hopes that it would fill the hole left behind. "I'd probably want to kill every wolf in Montana," Michael admitted. "But wanting something and doing something are different things." "Are they? You're carrying that thing like it's your own child. You're risking your job, maybe your life, for an animal that would rip your throat out if it had the strength. Tell me, that's not crazy." Luna's breathing had become more labored, and Michael could feel her body temperature dropping. Whatever internal injuries she had sustained were getting worse, and time was running out. Maybe it is crazy, Michael said, but 8 years ago, Sarah died because she swerved to avoid hitting a pack of wolves. She could have plowed right through them, could have saved herself, but she didn't. She chose to protect them even though it cost her everything. Frank's rifle wavered slightly. This wolf might be one of the ones from that night. Hell, I'm pretty sure she is. But carrying her isn't about the wolf, Frank. It's about trying to be the kind of man Sarah thought I was. It's about doing something she would have done even if it kills me. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind in the aspens and Luna's increasingly ragged breathing. Frank's face was a battlefield of emotions, grief and anger warring with something that might have been understanding. Danny would have liked that story, Frank said finally, lowering his rifle. Always was a sucker for the underdog. Michael didn't trust himself to speak. He simply nodded and adjusted his grip on Luna, who had gone alarmingly still in his arms. "Get going," Frank said, stepping aside. "That wolf don't look like she's got much time left." As Michael passed him, Frank reached out and touched Luna's head gently, his weathered fingers stroking her silver fur. "Sorry, girl," he whispered. "Wasn't your fault my boy was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Michael wanted to say something profound, something that would heal the rift between them, or at least acknowledge Frank's gesture. But Luna chose that moment to convulse in his arms, blood frothing at her muzzle. And suddenly there was no time for words. He ran the rest of mile 6 and all of mile 7, his back screaming and his lungs burning, while Luna fought for every breath in his arms. The veterinary clinic sat on the outskirts of Whitefish like a beacon of hope, its modest brick facade and hand-painted sign reading Clearwater Animal Hospital never looking more beautiful to Michael's exhausted eyes. But as he stumbled across the gravel parking lot, Luna limp in his arms, the first drops of rain began to fall from the darkening sky. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon was finally making good on its promise. Dr. Sarah Clearwater was waiting for him at the front door, her long black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face grave with concern. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades dealing with medical emergencies. But Michael could see the uncertainty in her dark eyes as she took in the sight of him, carrying a full-grown wolf. "Michael, what in God's name?" "She's dying," he gasped, barely able to get the words out. His legs were shaking so badly he could hardly stand, and sweat poured down his face despite the cooling air. "Snare trap. Lost a lot of blood. Please, Sarah, I know this is against protocol, but get her inside. Now!" Dr. Clearwater stepped aside, holding the door open. "Examination room 2. Quickly." The clinic's interior was warm and bright, filled with the familiar smells of antiseptic and animal medication. Michael had been here before with various injured wildlife over the years, but never with anything like this. Never with something that felt so personal, so loaded with history and guilt. He placed Luna gently on the steel examination table, his arms cramping as he finally released the weight he'd been carrying for miles. The wolf's breathing was shallow and rapid, her golden eyes glazed with pain and shock. Blood from the snare wound had soaked through his jacket and was now pooling on the table's surface. "How long has she been unconscious, Doctor?" Clearwater was already moving, pulling on latex gloves and gathering medical supplies with practiced efficiency. "On and off for the past few miles. She keeps looking at me, like she—" Michael trailed off, realizing how insane it would sound. "Like she what?" "Like she knows me." Dr. Clearwater's hands paused for just a moment as she prepared a syringe. "Michael, you know I have to ask. What made you decide to carry a wild wolf 12 miles instead of following standard protocol?" It was the question he'd been dreading, the one he had no good answer for. How do you explain 8 years of guilt condensed into a moment of recognition? How do you tell someone that you think this animal might be connected to the worst night of your life? I don't know, he said finally. I couldn't leave her there to die. The clinic door chimed and Margaret Whitehorse appeared, her silver hair damp from the rain and her face flushed with exertion. At 67, Michael's mother still moved with the brisk efficiency of the school principal she'd once been, but he could see the worry in her blue eyes as she took in the scene. "Jake called me," she said without preamble. "Said you'd found an injured wolf and were doing something typically stubborn and noble." Her gaze moved to Luna on the examination table, and her expression softened. "Oh, sweetheart. What happened to you?" "Maggie, you shouldn't be here," Dr. Clearwater said, but not unkindly. "This is already complicated enough without—" "That boy has been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for 8 years," Margaret interrupted, moving to stand beside her son. "If he thinks this is important enough to risk his career over, then it's important enough for his mother to be here." Michael felt tears prick at his eyes. He was 42 years old, a grown man with children of his own, but having his mother there made him feel like the scared little boy he'd been during his father's long illness, when the world had seemed too big and too frightening to face alone. Dr. Clearwater had been working while they talked, checking Luna's vital signs and examining the snare wound under a bright examination light. Her movements were careful and professional, but Michael could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened as she assessed the damage. "The good news is that the trap missed the major arteries," she said finally. "The bad news is that she's lost a significant amount of blood, and I'm seeing signs of infection. She's also—" Dr. Clearwater paused, her hands moving to Luna's abdomen. "She's pregnant, very pregnant. I'd say she's within days, maybe hours, of giving birth." The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain pattering against the windows and Luna's labored breathing. Michael felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. "Pregnant," he repeated numbly. 3, possibly 4 cubs based on what I can feel, which complicates everything." Dr. Clearwater's voice was professional, but Michael could hear the underlying concern. The stress and blood loss could trigger premature labor if that happens. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret moved closer to the examination table, her weathered hand hovering over Luna's silver fur. "She's beautiful," she said softly. "Those markings on her face. I've never seen anything quite like them." Michael's heart stopped. The crescent moon marking along Luna's muzzle was clearly visible under the bright lights, and suddenly he was 8 years old again, standing in his grandmother's kitchen, while she told him stories about the old ways, about animal spirits and the connections that bind all living things together. "The crescent moon," he whispered. "What?" Dr. Clearwater looked up from her examination. "That marking. I've seen it before." Michael's voice was barely audible. 8 years ago, the night Sarah died, there was a pack of wolves crossing the highway, and the alpha female, she had that exact same marking." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Clearwater's hands stilled, and Margaret's eyes widened with something that might have been recognition or understanding. "Michael," his mother said gently, "are you saying you think this is the same wolf from that night?" "I don't think it. I know it." The words came out stronger than he felt. "I've had 8 years to remember every detail of that night, every shadow, every movement. This is her. This is the wolf Sarah died trying to save." Dr. Clearwater stepped back from the table, pulling off her gloves with sharp, decisive movements. "Michael, even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, it doesn't change the medical facts. This animal needs immediate surgery if she's going to survive. The snare wound needs to be cleaned and sutured, and if she goes into labor during the procedure, she'll die," Michael finished. "She might die anyway. The stress of surgery combined with pregnancy complications, the odds aren't good." Outside, the storm was intensifying. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the pine trees surrounding the clinic. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Luna's eyes fluttered open, fixing on Michael's face with that same unsettling intelligence he'd noticed in the forest. Her breathing was growing more shallow, and he could see her strength fading by the minute. "What would Sarah do?" Margaret asked quietly. The question hit Michael like a physical blow because he knew the answer immediately, without hesitation. Sarah would fight. She would fight for this wolf and her unborn cubs the same way she'd fought for every injured animal, every struggling student, every lost cause that crossed her path. "She'd tell you to save them all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every life, no matter how small, no matter what the odds." Dr. Clearwater looked between Michael and his mother, then down at Luna, who was watching the conversation with those impossibly intelligent golden eyes. For a moment, the only sound was the storm outside and the steady beep of the heart monitor she'd attached to the wolf's chest. "If I do this," she said finally, "I could lose my license. Treating wild animals without proper permits, especially wolves. The state board doesn't look kindly on that sort of thing." "I know," Michael said, "and I know I have no right to ask this of you. But she's not just any wolf. She's connected to Sarah somehow, to our family. I can't explain it, but I feel it." Margaret reached out and took her son's hand, her grip firm and warm. "Sometimes," she said, looking directly at Dr. Clearwater, "we have to choose between what's legal and what's right. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to honor someone we've lost by saving someone who's still here." The heart monitor's beeping was growing more erratic, and Luna's breathing had become increasingly labored. Time was running out, and they all knew it. Dr. Clearwater closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, her expression was resolute. "Prep Surgery Room 1, she said, moving toward the supply cabinet. "We're going to need all the help we can get." As they wheeled Luna toward the surgical suite, Michael felt something shift inside his chest. Not quite hope, but something close to it. For the first time in 8 years, he was doing something Sarah would have been proud of. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small clinic, 3 people prepared to fight for the life of a wolf and her unborn cubs, driven by love, loss, and the stubborn belief that some connections transcend death itself. The surgery had been going for 3 hours when everything went wrong. Michael sat in the clinic's waiting room, his head in his hands, listening to the storm rage outside, while the sounds of medical emergency filtered through the thin walls of the surgical suite. The steady beep of monitors had given way to urgent voices and the rapid shuffle of feet, and he knew, without being told, that Luna was dying. Dr. Clearwater emerged from surgery looking like she'd aged a decade in the span of minutes. Her scrubs were stained with blood, her hair had come loose from its ponytail, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd just watched life slip away despite her best efforts. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We lost her." The words hit Michael like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his vision blur. After 12 miles of carrying her, after the confrontation with Frank, after choosing to fight for her life despite every regulation and protocol, she was gone. "The cubs?" Margaret asked from where she'd been pacing near the window. "One stillborn? The other 3? Dr. Clearwater shook her head. "They're not viable. Too premature. Too small. I don't think they'll make it through the night." Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. The sound was harsh and final in the sudden silence of the clinic. Outside, lightning illuminated the parking lot in stark black and white, and thunder rolled across the valley like the footsteps of an angry god. "I killed her," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. 8 years ago, I killed her mate and her pack. Tonight, I killed her and her cubs. "Michael, no," his mother started. "I should have left her in the trap. Should have called Fish and Wildlife like protocol demanded. She'd be dead, but at least she'd have died where she belonged, in her territory, not on some cold steel table surrounded by strangers." The grief was overwhelming, bigger than anything he'd felt since Sarah's funeral. It crushed down on him like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to believe he deserved to keep existing in a world where everything he touched seemed to die. Dr. Clearwater was saying something about doing everything possible, about how sometimes nature makes its own decisions regardless of medical intervention. But her words sounded distant and meaningless against the roar of self-recrimination in Michael's head. He'd failed. Again. Just like he'd failed Sarah by getting drunk and forcing her to drive in the storm. Just like he'd failed his sons by being an absent father, too wrapped up in his own guilt to see how much they needed him. Just like he'd failed Luna by thinking he could somehow make amends for the past by saving her life. "The cubs," Dr. Clearwater was saying, and something in her tone made Michael look up. "There's something you should know about the cubs." Through the surgical suite's viewing window, he could see 3 tiny forms in an incubator, smaller than kittens, their eyes still closed, their breathing barely visible. They looked impossibly fragile, like dreams made flesh. "What about them?" Margaret asked. "They're not just any wolf cubs. Based on Luna's size and the markings I can already see developing, these are alpha genetics. If they survive, and it's a big if, they'll be the foundation of a new pack. Luna's legacy." Michael stared at the tiny creatures fighting for life in their artificial womb. One of them, slightly larger than the others, had a faint marking along its muzzle that might someday become a crescent moon like its mother's. "She knew," he said suddenly. "That's why she let me carry her. She knew she was dying, and she wanted her cubs to have a chance." The thought should have brought comfort, some sense that Luna's death had meaning. Instead, it made the grief worse. She'd trusted him with the most precious thing in her world, and he'd failed her. The lights in the clinic flickered as another lightning strike hit somewhere nearby, and in that moment of strobing illumination, Michael saw his reflection in the window, a man hollowed out by loss, surrounded by the consequences of his choices. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I can't keep destroying everything I try to save." Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, and inside the small clinic, 3 orphaned wolf cubs fought for their first breath while the man who'd carried their mother to safety finally broke under the weight of 8 years' worth of guilt. The revelation came at 3:47 a.m., when Dr. Clearwater was checking on the cubs for what she assumed would be the last time. Michael had been sitting in the same chair for hours, staring at nothing, while Margaret dozed fitfully on the small couch near the window. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind the kind of crystalline silence that only comes after nature has exhausted its fury. The cubs' breathing had grown increasingly shallow throughout the night, and everyone in the clinic had been waiting for the inevitable. But when Dr. Clearwater entered the surgical suite to check their vitals, she stopped cold. Luna's body, which had been lying still on the operating table for over 6 hours, was warm to the touch. Not the artificial warmth of heated blankets, but the deep, steady warmth of a living creature. "That's impossible," she whispered, pressing her stethoscope to Luna's chest. The heartbeat was faint but unmistakable, a slow, steady rhythm that shouldn't have existed. She burst through the doors into the waiting room, her face pale with shock. Michael, Michael, you need to see this. He looked up from his vigil, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. What is it? Are they? Luna's alive. The words hung in the air like something fragile and impossible. Margaret sat up straighter, her hand flying to her chest while Michael simply stared at Dr. Clearwater as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. That's not possible, he said finally. You checked for a pulse. You said she was gone. She was gone. For over 6 hours there was no heartbeat, no brain activity, nothing. But now, Dr. Clearwater was shaking her head, her medical training warring with what she'd witnessed. I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Michael stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. Through the viewing window he could see Luna's chest rising and falling with the slow, deep breaths of sleep rather than the desperate gasps of dying. Her golden eyes were closed, but there was something peaceful about her expression, as if she'd found the rest that had eluded her in life. The cubs? Margaret asked, moving to join them at the window. Stronger. All 3 of them are stronger. It's as if... Dr. Clearwater trailed off, clearly struggling with the implications of what she was saying. As if what? As if her returning somehow gave them the strength they needed to survive. Michael pressed his hand against the glass, watching Luna's steady breathing. The crescent moon marking on her muzzle was clearly visible under the soft lighting, and for a moment he could swear he saw her eyes flutter as if she sensed his presence. I need to tell you something, Dr. Clearwater said quietly. Something I should have mentioned earlier, but I wasn't sure until now. She led them to her office, a cramped space filled with medical journals and photographs of the animals she'd treated over the years. From a filing cabinet, she pulled out a thick folder marked with a date from 8 years ago. After the accident that killed your wife, the state brought me several injured wolves from that pack. Most were too badly hurt to save, but there was one, an alpha female with distinctive markings. She opened the folder, revealing photographs and medical charts. I treated her for 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding, and severe trauma. She was pregnant then, too. Michael's hands shook as he looked at the photographs. The crescent moon marking was unmistakable, but the wolf in the pictures was younger, her coat darker, her eyes bright with the fierce intelligence of a creature in her prime. She survived? Margaret asked. More than survived. She thrived. But here's what I didn't put in the official report. She kept coming back. For months after her release, she would appear at the edge of the clinic property just watching, never aggressive, never threatening, just observing. Dr. Clearwater turned to another page, showing maps marked with red dots. These are all the reported wolf sightings in your area over the past 8 years, Michael. Look at the pattern. The dots formed a rough circle around Michael's property, with clusters near the elementary school where Sarah had taught, the baseball field where Jake played, the hiking trails where the family used to walk together. She's been watching your family, Dr. Clearwater said softly. For 8 years, Luna has been keeping track of you and your boys. Michael stared at the maps, his mind reeling. Every camping trip, every hike, every moment of seeming solitude in the wilderness, they'd been watched, protected, by the very creature he thought he'd wronged. But why? He whispered. Margaret reached over and took his hand, her grip warm and steady. Maybe because she understood something you never did, son. Maybe she knew that night wasn't anyone's fault. Not yours, not Sarah's, not hers. Maybe she's been trying to tell you that for 8 years. Through the office window, Michael could see into the surgical suite where Luna lay peacefully, her cubs nursing for the first time since their birth. The sight should have been impossible. A wolf who'd been dead for hours suddenly returned to life, caring for premature cubs who'd defied every medical prediction. There's something else, Dr. Clearwater said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I noticed during the surgery but didn't mention because it seemed too incredible to believe." She pulled out a final photograph from the folder, a close-up of Luna's injured leg from 8 years ago. "Look at the scar pattern here and compare it to the injury she sustained today." Michael studied the images. The old scar ran diagonally across Luna's hind leg, while the fresh wound from the snare trap formed an intersecting line. Together, they created a shape that made his breath catch in his throat. A cross, a perfect cross, scarred into the leg of a wolf who died and somehow returned to life. "In some native traditions," Margaret said quietly, "animals that carry the mark of the cross are considered sacred, messengers between the world of the living and the world of the spirits." Michael looked up at his mother, seeing something in her eyes that he'd never noticed before. A deep, abiding faith that went beyond the Christianity she'd raised him with, reaching back to older beliefs, older wisdoms. "You think she came back from the dead to forgive me?" he asked. "I think," Margaret said, "that forgiveness was never yours to seek. I think Luna has been trying to show you that for 8 years, and tonight was the only way she could make you listen." As if summoned by their conversation, Luna's eyes opened in the surgical suite. Through the glass, she looked directly at Michael, and for the first time in 8 years, he felt the crushing weight of guilt begin to lift from his shoulders. She had forgiven him long ago. The question now was whether he could forgive himself. 3 months later, Michael stood at the edge of his property watching Luna play with her cubs in the morning sunlight. The makeshift sanctuary he'd built in his backyard had grown into something more permanent with help from the community. A spacious enclosure that gave the wolves room to roam while keeping them safe from those who might not understand their unique situation. The cubs had thrived beyond all medical expectations. Storm, the largest of the 3, already showed signs of inheriting his mother's intelligence and natural leadership. His sisters, Dawn and River, were smaller but no less spirited, chasing each other through the tall grass while Luna watched with patient maternal eyes. The crescent moon marking on Storm's muzzle had indeed developed, fainter than his mother's but unmistakably there. Dr. Clearwater said it was genetics, but Michael had begun to believe it was something more, a sign of the continuity between generations, the way love and forgiveness could be passed down like any other inheritance. "Dad?" Jake appeared at his elbow, now 17 and taller than his father, with Sarah's eyes and her gift for seeing the best in people. "Mom called. She's bringing Tommy home from his sleepover, and she wants to know if you need anything from town." Michael smiled at the familiar slip. Jake still sometimes referred to Margaret as Mom, a habit that had developed naturally after Sarah's death and had become even more pronounced since Luna's arrival. His mother had moved into the guest room to help care for the wolves, and somewhere along the way the arrangement had become permanent. The house felt full again in a way it hadn't for 8 years. "Tell her we're good," Michael said, "but ask if she can pick up more of that special formula Dr. Clearwater ordered." "Storm's been eating like he's planning to be twice his mother's size." Jake grinned. "He probably is. Tommy's been reading wolf facts online, and apparently male wolves can grow up to be 40% larger than females." It was a normal conversation, the kind of easy exchange between father and son that Michael had thought he'd lost forever. The guilt that had poisoned his relationship with his boys for 8 years had finally begun to lift, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: contentment. The sound of tires on gravel announced Margaret's return with Tommy, who burst from her truck like a miniature tornado of excitement. At 13 now, he'd grown 3 inches in the past year and discovered an encyclopedic passion for wolf behavior that rivaled any wildlife biologist's. "Dad, did you see what Luna did this morning? She was teaching the cubs how to hunt using that old tennis ball you gave them." It's exactly like the documentary said. Alpha females pass on survival skills through play behavior. Michael ruffled his youngest son's hair, marveling at how much lighter the world seemed when viewed through Tommy's enthusiastic eyes. "Show me," he said, and together they walked to the observation deck Michael had built along one side of the enclosure. Luna looked up at their approach, her golden eyes bright with recognition. Over the past months, she'd developed a routine of acknowledging each family member when they appeared. A nod for Margaret, a tail wag for the boys, and for Michael, that same steady gaze that had sustained him through the darkest night of his life. "She's beautiful," a voice said from behind them. Michael turned to see Dr. Clearwater approaching with her weekly medical bag and a man he didn't recognize, elderly, Native American, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen more than his share of the world's wonders and sorrows. "Michael, I'd like you to meet Joseph Bearcloud. He's an elder from the Blackfeet Nation and something of an expert on wolf behavior." Joseph extended a weathered hand, his grip firm and warm. "Your Dr. Clearwater has told me quite a story about Luna and her family. I came to see for myself." As they watched, Luna approached the fence line, her cubs following cautiously behind her. She stopped just a few feet away and sat, her posture relaxed but alert, clearly assessing the newcomer. Joseph spoke to her in a language Michael didn't recognize, his voice low and melodic. Luna's ears pricked forward, and she tilted her head as if she understood every word. "What did you tell her?" Tommy asked, fascinated. "I thanked her for choosing your family," Joseph replied. "And I told her that her sacrifice had created something beautiful, not just new life, but new understanding between our peoples and hers." Margaret joined them on the observation deck, carrying a tray of coffee and the homemade cookies that had become her signature offering to anyone who visited the sanctuary. "Joseph was just telling me about the old stories," she said, settling beside Michael on the bench he'd built for Sarah but that his mother had claimed as her own. About wolves who chose to live alongside humans not as pets but as partners. "The boundary between our worlds has always been thinner than most people realize," Joseph said, accepting a cup of coffee with a grateful nod. "Animals like Luna understand things we've forgotten, that forgiveness isn't something you give or receive, it's something you choose to live." Storm had grown bold enough to approach the fence, his golden eyes, so like his mother's, fixed on Michael with that same unsettling intelligence. Michael reached through the chain link to scratch behind the young wolf's ears, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "The State Wildlife Commission has made their decision," Dr. Clearwater said quietly. "Luna and the cubs can stay here permanently under your care. It's unprecedented, but given the circumstances," she smiled. "Let's just say that sometimes bureaucrats are capable of recognizing miracles too." The news should have brought relief, but Michael felt something deeper, a sense of completion, as if a circle that had been broken 8 years ago was finally whole again. As afternoon faded into evening, the visitors departed, and the family settled into their familiar routines. Jake worked on college applications at the kitchen table while Tommy researched wolf pack dynamics for a school project. Margaret prepared dinner, humming an old hymn that Sarah used to sing while she cooked. Michael stepped onto the back porch to watch Luna settle her cubs for the night. The routine was always the same. She would check the perimeter of the enclosure, ensure her cubs were safely bedded down, then position herself where she could see both the forest beyond and the house where her chosen human family slept. "You know," Margaret said, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of tea, "I think Sarah would be proud of what you've built here." Michael accepted the tea gratefully, breathing in the familiar scent of chamomile and honey. "I used to wonder what she'd think about all this, the wolves, the sanctuary, turning our backyard into something out of a nature documentary. And now?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching Luna's silhouette against the darkening sky. "Now I think she probably had a hand in it," Somehow, somewhere, she's been pulling strings to make sure Luna found her way to us." Margaret squeezed his shoulder. "She always did have a talent for bringing strays home." As if she'd heard them talking about her, Luna lifted her head and looked toward the porch. For a moment, the three of them, man, woman, and wolf, shared a perfect understanding that transcended species and circumstance. They were family. They were home. And for the first time in 8 years, that was enough. Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry aren't the weight on our shoulders, but the weight in our hearts. Michael Whitehorse spent 8 years believing he was responsible for his wife's death, carrying guilt that poisoned every relationship and stole joy from every moment with his children. But when he found Luna trapped and dying in that forest, he discovered something profound. Forgiveness had been waiting for him all along, offered by the very creature he thought he'd wronged. Luna didn't just survive that night 8 years ago. She spent every day since watching over Michael's family, protecting the children of the man who blamed himself for her pack's destruction. Her message was clear. Some connections transcend tragedy. And love doesn't end with loss. It transforms. At 67, Margaret Whitehorse found new purpose caring for orphaned wolf cubs. Dr. Clearwater discovered that breaking rules sometimes serves a higher law, and Michael learned that redemption often comes in forms we never expect. The sanctuary they built became more than a home for wolves. It became a testament to second chances, to the healing power of service, and to the truth that our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts when we choose love over guilt. What burden from your past is still weighing on your heart? Have you ever experienced forgiveness from an unexpected source? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the healing we need comes from the connections we make with others who understand.